Welcome to Conversations. I'm Muqtedar, your host, and today I have something very interesting to present to you. I'm happy to present my latest anthology, an edited volume published by the New Lines Institute, one of the hottest think tanks in Washington, D.C. these days. The anthology is titled Emerging Global Order After the Russia-Ukraine War. And in this anthology, I bring you scholars from the US, Europe, and South Asia who reflect upon how the world might look like once this war comes to an end. They identify the drivers of change. We are living in an era of global transformation, and these scholars identify when and how the world started changing. And they also speculate and try and make a convincing argument as to how the world might look at the end of the Russia Ukraine war. I'm not going to reveal all their arguments because I do want you to read the book. And so I'm just going to drop teasers about the scholars and their arguments. But before I do that, please subscribe to Conversations, ring the bell icon, like the video, and I'm sure you will like this idea of the book. So do visit the website. The book is free. You can access all the chapters independently, or you can download the entire PDF of the book, and you can use it in your classrooms. You can use it for your research, and you can also use it to think about how the world is changing. We live in an era of quite exciting transformations. So the idea of the book is basically to identify two or three things as to how the structure of the world is changing, how are the existing global institutions which govern global politics are changing, and what, if any, new values are emerging that are going to replace the liberal international order and the values that underpin the liberal international order. So that was how I set the book up. The first chapter is by me, an introduction, in which I try to basically make the case that the world is changing significantly, and the changes that we are going to see, which will become crystal clear at the end of the Russia-Ukraine war, is going to be transformative. We are going to have a new world order, undoubtedly. But what kind of an order is it going to be? What are the values that will shape that order? And for that, we have these different perspectives from different scholars. In my essay, I also summarize the arguments that these scholars make. The second chapter is by Professor Amitava Acharya, who is a UNESCO chair and distinguished professor at the American University. And he is one of the most prominent scholars who has articulated the theoretical point of view, which is non-Western, essentially in nature. So not only does he write about non-Western perspectives of international relations, but he also advances a non-Western perspective. He is quite an important scholar. He was also the president of the International Studies Association. Amitava Acharya argues, and in trying to present a perspective of the global South, that we are living in a post-American order already, and he kind of echoes Fareed Zakaria's concept of the post-American order. He argues that this war was, regardless of what others might say, one of the factors that triggered this war is the Eastern expansion of NATO. And so he provides a critique of the NATO expansion from the global South perspective. And he makes an interesting point. He says that the global order that is emerging is not just multipolar, but it is also a multiplex order. So what he means by a multiplex world order is that that the world is going to be fragmented into certain regional clusterings, which will possibly have different types of organizations, different types of governing mechanisms, different types of alliances, and different types of institutions. So it's quite possible that you could have a Western system with NATO and Western institutions that hold the region together, and you could have an Eastern region where, say, an organization like the SCO could be a dominant institution which is holding together. And so he's making a very provocative argument that the world is going to change and is going to essentially emerge with many mini worlds, so to speak. So please read his argument. It's very fascinating and gives you a lot of things to think about how the world might be organized in the near future. The third chapter is by Professor Shibli Telhami, who is the Anwar Sadat Professor at the University of Maryland, College Park. He's also, for a long time, been a non-resident fellow of the Brookings Institution. He has one leg in academia and one leg in the policy circles. He has advised U.S. foreign policy and presidents on U.S. approach to the Middle East. He takes a very interesting departure. His point of view is that the post-Cold War global order can be bookended or sandwiched between two invasions, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990 and the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So what does it mean, really? He's saying that the world order after 9/11 was more or less, after the end of the Cold War, was more or less in a flux. And after Kuwait was annexed by Iraq and the US response, essentially established what we call as the unipolar moment of the United States, with the rule-based governance model and the liberal international order essentially emerged with that invasion. And now this invasion shows that that particular order is coming to an end. He also is a bit more nuanced in his understanding, and he also argues that even though the United States essentially underwrote the liberal international order, the United States also did a lot to actually undermine it itself. So the order that the US foreign policy was promoting was often undermined by US domestic concerns and US domestic politics. He also realizes and argues that perhaps Russia had sensed that the liberal international order was weakened because the very people who were defending it were also weakening it, and perhaps that encouraged Russia to invade Ukraine. And so he basically argues that both Russia and the United States are perhaps responsible in bringing the liberal international order to an end. The third essay is by Rafael Marchetti. Rafael Marchetti is the deputy rector and professor at the University of Louis in Rome. He's a very prominent scholar in Europe on international relations, and he makes an interesting point. He says that the current global order was actually beginning to weaken in 2008 with the economic crisis that we experienced in 2008. And from then on, he says the fragmentation of the world really began. He says that from 1990s onwards till 2008, there was forces that were integrating the world economically. We had globalization, and there were political and economic integration of the world. But from 2008, we see the fragmentation of the same global order. And as a result of that gradual fragmentation, you see what is happening with the Russia-Ukraine war. He posits that there are three possible scenarios that can emerge after the war. He says, one, it is possible that the West and the rest of the world will be locked in a bipolar struggle. He also argues that it is possible that the Eurasia, which means Europe and the Russian-Chinese system, will come closer and isolate the United States. So you could have a system which is an integration of Eurasia with isolation of the United States. And the third possibility, he suggests, is the opposite of that, whereas with a resounding victory for the West, it is quite possible the West will expand even further and lead eventually to the isolation of China. And therefore, basically, he makes the point, which I also make in my introductory chapter, that one of the possibilities is the emergence of a bipolar system with the United States and Russia as the two poles, and the relationship between these two countries will essentially determine the values and the structure of the global order that is going to emerge after the war of the Russia-Ukraine war. Our last chapter is by three scholars who wrote this together. They're all from South Asia. We have Marufa Akhtar from Bangladesh, Shelly Johnny from Kerala in India, and Farooq Leghari from Pakistan. They have an interesting take on this. They argue that perhaps the world is going to become a multipolar world after the end of this war. And they see two things emerging after the war. One, the rise of mid-level powers like Russia, India, China, and even Brazil, creating a multipolar world. And they also see that these same leaders, especially from the BRICS group, establishing regional hegemonies. So you will see regional orders emerging. They also argue that the United States foreign policy and grand strategy, especially in South Asia, does not take into account the national interests of these countries. They try to use it essentially for strategic purposes. And so one of the points that they are trying to make is that it is important for the United States to recognize, and for that matter, China also to recognize that these countries have very particular concerns. They're all very vulnerable to climate change. And so it is important that the emerging global order, whether it is multipolar or not, should take into account the interests of South Asian countries, especially their vulnerability to climate change. So this is an interesting collection of essays. It provokes thought. It gives you new directions to think about. I hope all of you find this introduction that I have given provocative enough to go to New Lines Institute's website, download the PDF, read the essays. They are very beautifully formatted and presented. I'm going to post a link to the anthology right below in the video's description. I will also, if you see this announcement anywhere in the social media, the link to the book will be available very adjacent to the announcement for sure. So this is Muqtedar Khan, and thank you for watching Khanversations. If you have not already subscribed to the channel, please do so as soon as possible. Like the video, make sure that you share it with your social and political network. Until next time, take care. Bye.